Greetings, audiophiles and Legend of Korra fans. Oh, who am I kidding? Welcome, Bolin fans, to my reading of my fanfiction, Castle of Glass. Legend of Korra and the characters therein belong to their respective owners and creators. The original characters and the premise of this story belong to me. Enjoy! Part 3. Stone and Snow. Bolin rocked back on his heels, examining his handiwork. The sandstone had been hard to get his hands on, but he wanted to do this project right. Stacked together before him sat 5 wheel-shaped pieces of sandstone. They looked like thick dinner plates with a square hole in the middle. Not perfect, but they would do, he thought with a smile. He stepped back, spreading his feet shoulder-length apart. He bounced lightly a few times, arms tucked in a boxer's pose. Then, with 2 practiced punching motions, he sent his creation smashing against a nearby wall. He nodded with satisfaction at the way they hit and crumbled apart. Then he began gathering them back together with a sweep of his hands, up and around his head. "Bolin!" Kida's voice sounded surprised and confused. "What are you doing here?" He turned, a wide smile already on his face. "Stalking you?" This was intended as a joke, but Kida cocked an eyebrow. Bolin backpedaled hastily. "No, I mean, I know you cut through the park on your way to your waterbending lessons, so I made a surprise." He stood aside so she could see his creations. Kida tilted her head, her hair falling over one eye again. Bolin managed to contain his blush as he was once again struck by how cute she was. He explained, "They're for pro-bending. Not regulation, but they'll work. I even made them a little more breakable than the ones we normally use, because we don't have any gear to protect us." "Oh my gosh!" Kida's eyes got very bright. "Bolin, this is great! I'm totally skipping my waterbending lesson today. Teach me everything." Half an hour of instruction later found Kida and Bolin facing off in a mat against each other. They had found an open area in the park which was about the correct size to be an arena. Kida was clumsy at first. Bolin did his best to instruct her. He went easy, lobbing slow shots toward her, which she could practice dodging or knocking out of the air using water. She hastily bent the snow around her into ammunition, trying her best. Her water whip stopped short of Bolin for the 3rd time in a row, and Kida growled in frustration. "Ugh! I can't get this! I'm no good at this kind of bending. If only my father would have let me train with a different teacher than Mira." Her hands were balled into fists at her sides. "It's okay," Bolin assured her. "It takes a while to get the hang of it." "Are you sure I'm not allowed to use ice?" Kida questioned. "Sometimes I'm better with ice." "Do you want to hurt me?" Bolin asked, his mouth quirking into a lopsided smile. "I'd be careful." He could tell Kida's tone was joking, as she looked mutinously at the gush of water she had raised to hover in front of her. "Try widening your stance," Bolin suggested. "Here." He strode across to her, and before he had the chance to think better of it, he positioned himself behind her, arranging her legs with a nudge of his foot and posing her arms. He removed his hands from her wrists with a jerk, startled at himself for his forwardness. What happened to being guarded? He had a girlfriend. Kida knew he had a girlfriend, so what was he doing? He wasn't sure what to do with his hands for a panicked moment. Putting them on his hips seemed too aggressive, folding them across his chest seemed too guarded. He finally clasped them behind his back. He knew his cheeks were the color of Pabu's fur. He wished that the fire ferret was there. He could deflect from his own awkwardness with a cute animal. He had left Pabu with Mako because he didn't want to tempt Prin. Kida was laughing at him. Bolin met her gaze and saw how her smile wrinkled the corners of her eyes. His lips twitched, wanting to smile as well. Instead, he contained himself. "An old mentor of mine gave me some earthbending advice. I think it might work for you." "Tell me," said Kida eagerly. "All right." Bolin moved to stand beside her, and she copied his stance. "Every shot should come from your whole body. If you use only your arm or your leg, you lose control and power. Look. He demonstrated by punching with his arm alone. The stone he bent still flew, but only chipped when it hit a tree, deflecting off. He told me that your power comes from the earth. Draw that energy up from the earth through your legs, your torso, into your arm. He demonstrated again, careful to make his motions exaggerated so she could see them. I imagine a light traveling through me from the earth to my hand. The stone disc he picked up this time shattered when it hit the tree. See? Yeah. Kita looked focused, squinting at the tree he had struck. She mimicked his motions. This time her water whip snapped out and struck the tree with a resounding thwack. Good! Bolin cheered. Yes! Kita pumped her fist. She held out her hand for a high five. Bolin hesitated, then slapped his palm against hers. Her good mood was too damn infectious. And really, what had he been expecting? If he had wanted to avoid Kita, this was the opposite of how to do it. Making pro-bending discs and meeting her at her favorite park. Those sounded like the actions of someone who was interested in a girl, not someone being careful to keep his emotions to himself. What would Mako say? Bolin wondered as he walked back across the field to try their match again. He hadn't told his brother or Korra about Kita. It felt like he would jinx it if he did. Like their knowledge of her would make her vanish like smoke. Besides, Mako and Korra might shame him for seeing someone else while he was still technically dating Eska. The leech. He shuddered when he thought of her. Ready? Kita asked, an expression like an eager cat-mouse on her features. Bring it, Bolin said, shoving aside his previous thoughts. Kita did better. Her shots were still slow and clumsy, but no longer stopped short of reaching him. She even scored a few hits he wasn't expecting. He ramped up his game as well, though he was careful not to hit her too hard with his homemade discs. Bolin was beginning to work up a sweat. Hold on, he raised a hand and she stopped, the water she had been launching his way pausing. He watched, impressed, as she pinwheeled her arms, then twisted her torso, causing the water to come back to her and swirl around her before she spread her fingers, palms down, and motioned towards the snow, causing the water to fall around her. Damn. She might not be the best fighter, but she had excellent control. He suspected it came from years of working with the pottery, a very precise task. Bolin was almost distracted from the reason he had stopped the match. Then he remembered, unbuttoning his coat and pulling it off, watching out of the corner of his eye to see if she was noticing. Though his shirt was long-sleeved, it still showed off his muscular form. People tended to think he was overweight, a side effect of normally wearing baggy attire and frequently standing near lanky Mako. The pro-bending uniforms were flattering on very few. Korra had looked good, but she looked good in anything. Rather than feeling the usual rush of guilty heat that normally came from thoughts of Korra, he felt annoyed this time. Annoyed that she was always so good at everything. As Bolin slid his coat from his right shoulder, it twinged. The cold made it stiff these days, ever since he'd heard it in the arena. Korra had mended it, but it had never been quite the same. He ignored this, turning back to his opponent. His eyes widened. She had shed her coat as well, and he was treated to a view of her own figure. Her shirt, like his, was less than flattering, but better than a bulky coat. He took a moment to appreciate her slender, muscular frame. Ready? She bounced on the balls of her feet. Bolin reformed the sandstone into discs again, positioning them around himself. Oh yeah, he said, a cocky smile on his lips. Kita was much improved this round. Bolin had to work to dodge her blows. Even in the cold, sweat beaded on his brow. He was having fun, too. They laughed often. Sometimes Kita's attacks still went awry, and they both stopped for a good chuckle. Once, she accidentally soaked poor Prin, who hooted angrily and demanded that Kita stop and dry her off. Bolin held his sides as he laughed, watching Prin flutter angrily towards her owner, pecking Kita's hand as punishment for the dampening. Then the match was on again. Bolin got a few good shots, forcing Kita back into the third zone, which they had sketched into the snow. Then she spun, her feet dancing lightly, and Bolin dodged the water he guessed was coming on his left. Instead, it hit his right shoulder like a punch, too much force because he had stepped into it. Pain sliced up his arm. He made a sound that he wasn't proud of, clasping his shoulder and falling to a knee. Kita stopped, hands still raised. Her heart gave a tight twinge as she heard Bolin gasp and saw him go down. She rushed towards him. The water she had raised around her flew clumsily back to the ground. "Bolin!" she called, reaching him. She slid to her knees in the snow, coming up beside him. His head was still lowered so she couldn't see his face. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" "I shouldn't have tried that trick shot I came up with. Oh man." Her words tumbled from her lips like water over a fall. He finally looked at her. He was smiling, if tightly. "That trick shot worked really well," he said, though his teeth were clenched. "You should teach me." "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone still urgent. Without thinking, she guided him to stand, then walked him to a nearby rock to sit. "Yeah," he said. He was trying to act tough, but she could see how tense his muscles were. "It's an old injury. I guess it never quite healed right." "May I?" She hovered her hands over his shoulder, water already coiling around her fingers, ready to be used for healing. "Yeah, of course." Bolin took his hand away, watching her with his startling eyes. They made it hard for her to focus. She chewed her lip, resting her fingertips against his shoulder. She made herself close her eyes for a moment, sensing. "What are you doing?" Bolin asked, his voice quiet. "Who healed this?" Kita asked, her brows coming together over her closed eyes. "This was shoddy work. Your shoulder was dislocated and put back, but no one repaired the torn muscle. It didn't heal back properly. I think I can fix it, but..." He cut her off. "Korra did it. How can you tell all that about my shoulder?" Kita stepped back, pulling her hands away with a jerk, as though he had burned her. She'd done some asking around town about Bolin, and had uncovered that he was traveling with Avatar Korra. Still, the Avatar did that? Really? And she missed the obvious muscle tearing? Then Kita slapped a hand over her mouth. Crap, what was she doing? Speaking badly of the Avatar? In front of one of the Avatar's friends, no less? Smart, Kita. Really smart. Maybe she was in a hurry. Not helping, just shut up. Kita clamped her jaw tight. No more talking. She watched Bolin's face, feeling cold and nervousness flood through her. Bolin was still looking at her with a bright interest in his eyes. "Seriously, how did you do that thing where you could tell that I have muscle damage?" Was it possible that he hadn't noticed her bad-mouthing the Avatar's healing skills? Or maybe he didn't care. Kita shook her head, trying to clear it of thoughts of her own stupidity. "That? I've always been able to do it. Honestly, it's a form of bloodbending." "A what?" Bolin sprang back from her, his eyes wide and alarmed. Kita raised both hands in a calming motion. But Bolin flinched as though she was going to begin bloodbending him right then and there. No, she said, feeling suddenly lost. What had she said this time? "It's not bloodbending, not the illegal form. We don't control people. I would never." She lowered her arms slowly. She felt as though she had stumbled off of a sunny path and into a field of brambles. Every move she made was making the situation worse. Bolin stood back from her, gripping his injured shoulder defensively, but his expression softened. He was going to give her a chance to explain. Kita plunged ahead. "A lot of healers are using this technique. We feel how the blood moves through the body to detect the problem or injury. Then we can help the body mend itself, as we aid it with our own healing water from the outside. We never use it to control a person. I wouldn't even know how. Please believe me, Bolin," she gasped. She must have looked so pathetic that the earthbender moved closer to her again. He was still watching her, as though unsure now if she was a dangerous animal. "You've never taken anyone's bending away, have you?" Kita's eyes snapped up to meet his. "What? No. Oh, no, I could never do that. Is this because of what happened in Republic City? We heard some reports. Someone was using bloodbending to lock other people's bending away?" Bolin's voice was low. He stopped meeting her gaze. "It almost happened to me." I made a stupid mistake. If it wasn't for my brother and Korra, I would have... Oh, Bolin! Without thinking, Kita stepped towards him and slid her hand into his. They both realized what she had done at the same time. They blushed simultaneously, jerking their hands away again. Kita crossed her arms protectively over her chest. That must have been so frightening, she mumbled, eyes downcast. Well, yeah. Bolin seemed to be regaining his composure. He brushed the whole situation away with a wave of his hand. I wasn't that scared. I mean, he would have had one heck of a fight on his hands if he'd really tried to take my bending, that's for sure. He plopped back down on the rock. Kita stood cautiously for a moment before moving to stand beside him. She still felt uncertain. She wasn't eager to speak in case she messed everything up again. Bolin looked expectantly up at her. Are you going to fix my shoulder or what? He asked, a big goofy grin back in place. Kita couldn't stop her own easy smile. She reached gingerly forward, touching her fingertips to his arm, feeling the water around her rise to encircle her hands. The white-blue glow of healing water illuminated Bolin's face and shone in his eyes. Kita's smile grew wider. Then she closed her eyes and focused. She visualized Bolin's muscles, damaged and scarred. She swept her hand in a delicate circle, fingers loose and tickling his skin. She felt Bolin tense as she worked on his arm, soothing and repairing the damage. Most of the injuries she normally worked on were recent, not older like this one. Still, she could do it. She knew she could. Or what was the point of her daily training? There. She felt Bolin's blood run smoothly. The muscle was repaired. Still tender, but that would sort itself out. It would have been better had it been healed when the injury occurred in the first place, but beggars couldn't be choosers. She took her hand away, opening her eyes. She was met with Bolin's face, curious and impressed. He gently rotated his shoulder, then smiled at her. The stiffness is gone. It'll be a little sore, but it should be gone by tomorrow. She smiled at him, feeling proud of herself. She bent and scooped up a large handful of snow, setting it on his shoulder. This'll help. Thanks, Kita, Bolin said so earnestly that Kita blushed. I suppose we really shouldn't keep up our pro-bending training today, huh? I suppose not, Kita agreed. She sat down beside Bolin on the rock, expecting him to pull away as he had done the last time she had sat beside him. This time he seemed much more relaxed. Prin hopped eagerly from Kita's shoulder to Bolin's. The earthbender reached up and scritched the little creature's feathery chin. Prin peeped with pleasure, half closing her large eyes. So, tell me about Republic City. Kita pulled up her legs, hugging her knees and watching Bolin out of the corner of her eye. Sure, he said, leaning back and putting on an expression of a sage storyteller. Kita stifled a laugh behind her hand. The earthbender began his tale. He told her how big the city was, how it could take a day to get from the market district to the factory district if you took the time to stop at all his favorite food shops. He told her about his and Mako's home above the pro-bending arena, and the fire ferrets' rise to fame as a winning team. Kita drank it all in. Bolin was animated and free as he spoke. His descriptions tended to involve the words awesome or very cool. Kita laughed often, and every time she did, it seemed to encourage him to go to new heights of storytelling. What is it like being friends with the Avatar? Kita asked, watching as Bolin finished giving her a play-by-play of a pro-bending match he had helped win, though he was careful of his shoulder. He dropped his hands, which had been raised for dramatic effect. To be honest, he glanced around, making sure no one was listening. Kita sat forward. It's frustrating. Frustrating? Kita asked. Yeah, I guess so, Bolin said, as though the idea was Kita's instead of his own. He sat down beside her again, and she felt the warmth coming from him. He smelled a little musky from sweat, and she appreciated it silently. It's just, I'm used to friendships that go two ways, you know? Take my brother and me. When we were kids living on the streets of Republic City, we looked out for each other. One day he'd save me, next day I'd save him. It made sense. But Korra, she thinks she doesn't need anyone. Maybe she doesn't. He shrugged. She's dating Mako, and he barely gets to have an opinion in conversations, let alone help her out. At least he got to help her take out Amon. I'm a good friend when she remembers I'm there. The rest of the time, I think I'm just a burden. I never get to help her. That does sound frustrating, Kita sympathized. She sensed that there was more he wasn't telling her, but she didn't press. She wasn't used to people admitting things to her. She decided to change the subject slightly. What did you mean you and your brother were living on the streets in Republic City? Our parents died when we were really young. I barely remember them. Bolin looked at his hands, which rested in his lap. Mako remembers them better. After they died, we didn't have any place to go, so we were on the streets. When we got older, we ran with some gangs, just so we had food, a nice warm place to stay. Kita wrinkled her nose, skeptical. That sort of thing really happens? I thought those were only stories my father used to keep me from going to the city. Here, if a child's parents die, they get taken in by other relatives or adopted by another family. Seeing a kid living alone on the street would be totally alien to our culture. I think I like your culture better. Bolin gave her a quick grin. She wished it would stay. At least you and your brother had each other, Kita pointed out. I wish I had siblings. I think my parents just wanted a bender, like Mom, and when I was born they were satisfied and stopped. They wanted someone to carry on my mother's work so the family business would stay afloat. I think your shop is really cool, Bolin said, and your art is way better than anything I've seen in the city. Really? Kita felt herself blush again. Even if she did hate the job, the little praise for her work never hurt. Were you close with your mother? Bolin asked. Kita bristled. No. This wasn't exactly true. Kita had been no closer nor more distant with her mother than the other children she knew. But when her mother had died, Kita felt only anger. Suddenly she was expected to take over and fill her mother's shoes. The woman had left her with nothing but a shadow to stand in, and Kita still felt bitterness rather than sadness when she thought of the loss. Bolin seemed to sense her displeasure and didn't press the matter. Instead, he grinned sideways at her, nudging her playfully with his elbow. She bumped back with her own arm. Bolin scooted towards her, almost knocking her off the rock with his hip. Kita squeaked and struggled for balance, embarrassed by the feminine sound. She bumped back with her own hip, which had much less effect on the sturdy Bolin. Prin, disliking the sudden motion, fluttered away with a disgruntled hoot to sit on a nearby branch and glare disapprovingly at the pair. Kita tried harder, throwing her whole body against Bolin, who resisted with some difficulty, laughing jovially. What is that? A little turtle duck brushing up against me? What could it want? I'll turtle duck you, Kita growled, giving him another attempted shove. What does that even mean? Bolin chortled, using bending to dump her off the rock as he stood up. Kita fell into the snow, hastily bending it around her in a swirl to spray across Bolin's chest. I have no idea, she gasped for air as she tried to keep her laughter under control. Soon a snowball fight was in full swing. Stop cheating, Bolin shouted as Kita bent several snowballs at him. It's not cheating, it's using my natural abilities to my advantage. She popped her head up from behind the snow fort she had built for herself. It's not my fault waterbenders are best at snowball fights. Don't be jealous. Bolin had hastily constructed his own shelter out of earth, so it was much sturdier than Kita's, but he was forced to make snowballs by hand. He lobbed a few in Kita's direction. She dodged them easily. It is so cheating. The fight went well into the sunset hours. The southern water tribe city slowly came alive with pale, wintry streetlights, which reflected with an eerie beauty off the buildings and the crystalline trees. The stars soon showed their faces a few at a time, as though they were waking from under the blue blanket of day. Kita and Bolin lay down in the snow side by side, panting with weariness and beginning to shiver, though they had both put their coats back on. Kita was acutely aware of Bolin's proximity. She had the notion to try something, but she wasn't certain if it was a good idea. But then, when had something being a bad idea ever stopped her before? She tested the waters. So, Eska. Bolin spoke the name as a pained sigh. That was all the sign Kita needed. She rolled over, now on all fours, arms on either side of Bolin's shoulders. Her braid fell from her hood to the snow beside his cheek. Before he could react, Kita planted a kiss on his lips. Not a long one, a brief meeting of lips, and then she quickly pulled away and ran off, her laugh echoing after her. Bolin lay in the snow, staring at the stars, eyes wide with amazement. Had that really just happened? If it hadn't, he didn't want to know. He'd gladly live in that fantasy world. It took him several bewildered moments to sit up, but Kita was long gone.